All right, let's dive deep into the Nixon shock. We're going back to August 1971,
A pivotal moment.
when the world's financial system went through a major, like a seismic shift. Picture this. You go to the grocery store and prices are going through the roof,
Right.
but at the same time, your neighbor is losing their job.
A real dilemma.
It's that confusing reality of stagflation.
Tagflation, right.
Economists were baffled, like,
Yeah, they were scratching their heads trying to figure out what to do with
yeah,
it.
absolutely.
Because everything they thought they knew
Yeah,
about how an economy is supposed to work
right.
was being challenged.
Exactly. And on top of that, the system that was designed to keep global currencies stable, the Bretton Woods Agreement,
The post-World War II system,
yes,
that had served the world pretty well for a couple of decades.
it was showing major cracks, right?
Yeah, it was under immense pressure.
So remind us, how did Bretton Woods work?
Okay, so under Bretton Woods, the U.S. dollar was pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce.
So it was like a promise
A promise.
that other countries could always trade their dollars for gold at that price. That's what made the dollar the world's reserve currency.
Exactly. As good as gold.
But this promise was becoming harder and harder to keep.
Right, because the U.S. was grappling with some serious economic challenges. Inflation was on the rise,
Okay.
and more dollars were flowing out of the U.S. than coming in.
Creating a balance of payments deficit?
Yeah, think of it like spending more than you earn.
Right. Not sustainable.
Not at all.
So other countries, they started getting nervous.
Of course, because what if the U.S. couldn't keep its promise?
Right. What if the dollar was losing its value?
Losing its value.
And they wouldn't be able to buy the same amount of gold in the future.
Right, and that fear that the dollar was overvalued
Overvalue.
put a huge strain on the whole system.
And this fixed exchange rate, which was supposed to create stability,
Yeah, that was the irony.
became a source of tension.
Right. It became a straitjacket in a way.
How so?
Well, imagine a scenario where France, let's say, wants to boost its exports to make its goods more competitive.
Okay.
Under Bretton Woods, they can't simply devalue their currency, the franc.
Right, because it's tied to the dollar.
Exactly, they're stuck.
Wow. So the stage is set, a global financial system under immense pressure, and the U.S. economy is grappling with stagflation.
A very challenging situation.
But at the center of this storm, you have President Richard Nixon, a man obsessed with projecting strength, especially on the world stage.
Absolutely. And for Nixon, appearances mattered a lot,
He needed to be seen as in control.
especially with his re-election campaign on the horizon.
Right. So the stakes were incredibly high.
Absolutely. And to add to the complexity, Nixon was surrounded by a team of advisors with very strong personalities
Oh, I bet.
and clashing economic
If
philosophies.
he like who?
Well, you had John Connally, the Treasury Secretary,
Connally, the charismatic Texan.
with a very forceful personality.
Oh, yeah.
And he had these staunch nationalist views.
Right. He believed America's allies were taking advantage
Taking advantage, yeah.
and needed to be dealt with firmly.
He wasn't afraid to play hardball.
And then there's Paul Volcker, a figure at the Treasury, who was deeply respected.
Respected, but also a bit of an enigma,
An enigma. Okay.
known for keeping his cards close to his chest.
Right. And years later, of course, he'd become famous for his battles against inflation as Fed chair.
Exactly. But back in '71, he was advocating for more traditional policies.
Like fiscal and monetary discipline.
Right, and maintaining the gold standard,
Sticking to the rules.
at least initially.
And of course, we can't forget Arthur Burns, the seasoned Fed chair,
A veteran economist.
who found himself caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, caught between wanting to please the president
Right.
and maintain the Fed's independence.
That's a tough spot to be in.
It is, and Burns, a conservative economist at heart, he was really grappling with the political realities of the situation.
Right, because the pressure was mounting.
It was
And then you have George Shultz, a free market advocate,
a strong believer in limited government intervention.
who initially opposed things like government control.
Yeah, he was skeptical of those kinds of measures.
But he was also a loyal advisor to Nixon.
A pragmatist who understood the need to find workable solutions.
So you have this mix of personalities and viewpoints.
It was a very dynamic group.
That must have made for some interesting discussions.
Oh, absolutely.
Leading up to the Nixon shock.
The debates were intense.
And things really escalated in the months leading up to the decision, didn't they?
They did. The pressure was building.
Like, what happened in May of '71?
Ah, yes. May of '71. A crisis erupted in West Germany.
West Germany, okay.
They were facing a flood of speculative capital. And they made the decision to temporarily allow their currency, the Deutschmark, to float.
To float, so it wasn't tied to the dollar anymore.
Exactly. It was like pulling a thread.
Hmm.
That caused the whole system to start unraveling.
Because it triggered a massive outflow of dollars from the U.S.
Exactly. Investors got spooked.
They saw the Deutschmark floating.
And they started worrying about the dollar.
And that fear of a weakening dollar.
Yeah, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy.
People rushed to exchange their dollars.
For stronger currencies.
And this just added to the concerns about a potential run on the dollar.
And a drain on U.S. gold reserves.
Because everyone wanted to trade in their dollars for gold.
Right, they wanted something they perceived as more stable.
So the situation was becoming increasingly dire.
Nixon knew he had to act, and act decisively.
So, facing mounting pressure, he decides to convene a top-secret meeting at Camp David.
Camp David, the presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains.
Shrouded in secrecy.
Very few people knew the true purpose of the gathering.
This meeting would become the stage for some of the most consequential economic decisions of the 20th century.
Decisions that would not only impact global finance,
but also the everyday lives of Americans.
And it all unfolded over a single weekend.
A weekend that changed the world. It's Friday the 13th, no less. A group of powerful figures gathered at Camp David.
Isolated in the forested mountains.
With the weight of the world on their shoulders.
A real sense of urgency.
This was a pivotal moment for Nixon.
He was feeling the heat.
He needed a plan.
Something bold.
Something that would project strength and control.
Especially with that re-election campaign looming.
He knew these decisions
Yeah.
would have a huge impact on voters. So let's talk about the options on the table.
Okay, so Paul Volcker, ever the pragmatist,
Right.
had come prepared with a contingency plan.
It's amazing to think this is the same Volcker who, later as Fed chair, would tackle inflation head-on.
It is quite a contrast.
But back in '71, he was facing a different beast.
A different set of challenges altogether.
So what did his plan involve?
Well, his plan included options like closing the gold window,
Okay, a big one.
devaluing the dollar,
Right.
and imposing import restrictions.
A range of options.
Each with its own risks and potential consequences.
Almost like playing a high-stakes game of economic chess.
It's a good analogy.
And I imagine there were some disagreements.
Oh, absolutely. Clashing viewpoints.
Like Connally, for example.
Well, Connally. He was true to form,
Okay.
favoring a more aggressive approach.
In what way?
Well, he really wanted to put pressure on America's allies,
Okay.
particularly when it came to trade and defense spending.
He wanted to use this crisis as leverage.
You could say that.
But wouldn't that risk fracturing
Potentially.
the global financial system even further?
It was a risk.
So not everyone was on board with this.
Not necessarily. No.
What about Burns?
Burns, for instance, he was quite hesitant
About
closing the gold window.
why?
He was really worried about the potential fallout.
Global financial chaos.
Exactly. He understood the gravity of that decision.
And Schultz.
Right, Schultz being a proponent of free markets.
Yeah,
He was naturally wary of that import surcharge.
because it reeked of protectionism.
Right, he saw it as a dangerous precedent.
That could lead to a trade war.
It was a slippery slope in his view.
But at the same time, he was a loyal advisor to Nixon,
A pragmatist.
trying to find solutions.
Within those constraints.
So you have this incredible mix of personalities and ideologies. And at the center of it all is Nixon
Trying to make sense of it all.
make a decision that would define his presidency.
It was a defining moment
And it all came to a head. On that Saturday night meeting,
where the key decisions were made.
what can you tell us about that pivotal moment?
Well, the atmosphere was electric.
I bet.
A lot of tension in the room.
Understandably.
Volcker, he laid out a very stark assessment of the situation.
What did he say?
He argued that closing the gold window,
Right.
while a radical move,
Yeah.
was crucial to regain control over the dollar.
So a calculated gamble,
In a way, yes.
a shock to the system,
A way to reset the game board.
to force the Allies back to the negotiating table.
Exactly.
And domestically,
Yes.
they also decided on that 90-day wage price freeze,
A controversial move.
especially coming from a Republican administration.
You're right.
It was a significant intervention in the free market.
A sign of how desperate the situation had become.
So on that Saturday night at Camp David,
In that secluded setting,
the Nixon shock was truly conceived.
the die was cast.
And then came Nixon's primetime address to the nation,
On Sunday evening,
announcing his new economic policy to the world,
a bombshell announcement.
closing the gold window,
Right.
The import surcharge
Yes.
and the wage price freeze.
It sent shockwaves
I can imagine.
across the U.S. and around the globe.
What was the immediate fallout?
Well, it was a whirlwind.
Ugh.
Confusion, anger, uncertainty.
The Allies must have felt betrayed.
Many did. They saw this as a unilateral move.
Undermining global cooperation.
Yeah, the trust was shaken.
So Nixon achieved the shock he was aiming for.
He certainly did.
But at a potentially high cost.
There were consequences.
Financial markets went into a frenzy.
Volatility spiked.
And the dollar,
Freed from its fixed value to gold.
began to float.
A new era.
Did this mean the end of the Bretton Woods system?
Essentially, yes.
The end of an era.
The era of fixed exchange rates was over.
And back in the U.S., how did the American public react?
Well, opinions were divided.
As you might expect.
Some lauded Nixon for taking decisive action
Right.
to tackle those economic woes head-on,
Others were skeptical,
particularly about the wage price freeze.
seen as government overreach.
To some, yes.
But everyone sensed that things had changed,
A shift.
that the U.S. had entered uncharted territory.
A new landscape.
So the Nixon shock sent ripples throughout every level of society.
Both at home and abroad.
But the story doesn't end there.
No, it doesn't.
What happened in the months that followed?
Well, there were frantic negotiations with the U.S. allies
To try and stabilize the situation.
to find some common ground.
And this led to...
The Smithsonian Agreement
When was this?
in December of 1971
A few months after the shock.
was a sort of temporary truce
So they tried to patch up the system.
after the earthquake.
What did this agreement involve?
Well, it involved a devaluation of the dollar
Okay.
and a realignment of currencies.
A readjustment.
But the underlying issues remained.
Right. Those fundamental economic imbalances.
They hadn't gone away.
And the world was on the verge of a major shift
A new paradigm.
to a floating exchange rate regime.
The system we live with today.
And that's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
The legacy of the Nixon shock.
Stay tuned as we unpack the consequences of this pivotal event, from the rise of floating exchange rates to the ongoing challenges of global economic cooperation in a post-Bretton Woods world.
A world reshaped.
We'll also connect this historical event to your world today, exploring how decisions made in those secluded mountains continue to shape the 21st century economy.
Okay, so no more fixed exchange rate, no more dollar pegged to gold.
Gone.
What were some of the long-term consequences of this gamble?
Well, as we've seen, the fixed exchange rate system, it was gone for good,
The world shifted to a floating exchange rate system.
where currencies fluctuate based on
Market forces.
supply and demand.
Yeah, the invisible hand.
So that must have made global trade and finance a lot more
Predictable.
unpredictable, yeah.
Yeah, definitely more volatile.
But was there an upside to this?
Well, there was also an upside to this. You know, this newfound flexibility.
Okay.
Think about it this way. If a country, let's say, sees a drop in demand for its products,
Okay.
suddenly, its currency can depreciate,
Right.
making those products more affordable
More competitive.
on the global market.
So it's like a shock absorber,
Exactly.
helping to adjust to those economic ups and downs.
Smoothing out the bumps in the road.
So more volatility, but also more adaptability.
Yeah, a trade-off.
But this new system, it wasn't without its challenges, right?
No, not at all.
I mean, currencies could fluctuate wildly,
Creating a lot of uncertainty for businesses and investors.
trying to plan ahead.
Exactly.
And didn't the Nixon shock also fuel those protectionist sentiments?
It did, that import surcharge.
Right.
While temporary,
And to be.
it sent a message
Yeah.
that the U.S. was willing to put its own interests first,
America first.
even if it meant disrupting global cooperation.
Well, we hear those echoes even today, don't we?
Yeah, it's a recurring theme.
Especially during times of economic stress.
Those anxieties, they tend to resurface.
And the debates about government intervention.
Oh, those were reignited as well.
Because think about those wage and price controls.
A very controversial measure.
Yeah.
They provided some relief from inflation,
In the short term.
but their effectiveness in the long run, it's still debated among economists.
So how did this, the Nixon shock, impact the average American family?
Well, that shift to a floating exchange rate regime,
Okay.
despite the initial turmoil,
Right.
it gave the U.S. more freedom to manage its own economy.
Without being tied to that fixed value of the dollar.
And that ultimately contributed to greater stability and prosperity down the line.
But the 70s were a turbulent decade, weren't they?
They-
Inflation, the oil crises.
A lot of uncertainty.
I mean, it makes you wonder if we're seeing any parallels today.
Interesting question.
Could a similar economic shock happen again?
In a world that's so interconnected, with rapid technological advancements and geopolitical dynamics, it's certainly possible.
So the Nixon shock reminds us that economic systems are constantly evolving.
In flux.
And sometimes that evolution involves bold moves,
Moves that can cause disruption.
but ultimately lead to necessary change.
A recalibration.
Well, there you have it, our deep dive into the Nixon shock.
A moment that continues to shape how we understand economics and global finance.
From secret meetings at Camp David to the lasting impact on everyday Americans.
A story full of intrigue
Consequence.
and valuable lessons for today.
It reminds us that even events that seem like distant history
They can have a profound impact.
on the world we live in today. So keep exploring, keep questioning.
And keep learning.
Until next time, happy deep diving.